Great pleasure to introduce this year's Marshall lecturer, Raj Chetty. You may think that he was selected for this lecture because Chetty is like the closest we could get to the name of our president, Chettil. I don't know where you are, Chettil, but I can reveal that that's not how it works. And Raj Chetty is an incredibly successful and admired researcher. He needs no introduction, which is a standard phrase, but I'll take the implication of that to actually conjecture that you may even know less about Alfred Marshall than you know about Raj Chetty. So I will say a couple of words about Marshall, and then so Alfred, actually Raj asked me as we stepped up on stage, is this the Marshall lecture or is the Schumpeter lecture? It's the Marshall lecture. Yeah, so Alfred Marshall was born in 1842 and he died in 1924. And there are interesting parallels here. He moved during his lifetime across different top universities in UK, as you seem to be moving between places. He was at Cambridge, Oxford, and Bristol in particular. In 1890, he wrote, at the age of, I guess, 48, he published his Principles of Economics that had really profound and long-lasting impact on our profession. He was regarded as one of the most influential economists of his time, and maybe the most influential economist of his time. And I think it's particularly fitting to have Raj give this lecture for that reason. Marshall is considered one of the founding fathers of microeconomics as we study it. And in fact, many of the diagrammatic tools that you see in the undergraduate textbooks, the graphs and the supply demand, all that, was developed in this book, The Principles. So let me, he had students at Cambridge, including Keynes and Pigou and so on. Let me quote Wikipedia here. And it says about Alfred Marshall, his most important legacy was creating a respected, academic, scientifically founded profession for economists in the future that set the tone for the rest of the 20th century, which I think is a good transition because Raj is all that, and he's certainly a role model for economists, especially young economist researchers. And I think, and I hope you will do that just that for the 21st century. I mean, your field is kind of broadly speaking, public economics, theoretical, empirical, but the particular focus on the disadvantaged, I think, is kind of something I would like to stress. I think I should just let you show your work instead of me talking about it. Please welcome Raj Chetty.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Per, for the really thoughtful and warm introduction. Thank you for having me here. It's really a privilege and honor to be able to give the Marshall Lecture. So I'm going to talk today about how the origins of inequality and economic mobility are at a very granular local level. But I want to start at a much broader international level by talking about how economic mobility compares across countries, and start by talking about the notion of the American dream, which is something we talk a lot about in the United States and elsewhere. It's a multifaceted concept that I think means different things to different people. But one traditional way to conceptualize it is that no matter what your background, America is thought to be a place that's a land of opportunity, a place where children can climb up in the income distribution no matter their background. And so I want to start by just assessing the extent to which that is the case in fact, in the United States versus other countries around the world by focusing on a very simple measure of economic mobility. The chance that a child born to parents in the bottom fifth of the income distribution makes the leap to the top fifth of the income distribution. So a simple notion of upward mobility. So what do those statistics look like in the United States versus a few other countries around the world where we're able to construct comparable measures? So in the US, as you can see here, about 7.5% of kids who start out in the bottom fifth of the income distribution reach the top fifth. That compares with 9% in the United Kingdom, 11.7% in Denmark, and 13.5% in Canada. Now, in interpreting these differences, it's useful to keep in mind that you can't have more than 20% of people in the top 20%. And hence, if you think about what a natural upper bound would be on this measure, if you rule out the perverse case where being born to a higher income family reduces your chances of reaching the top of the income distribution, you would not expect these statistics, this measure, to exceed 20%. If this conditional probability was above 20%, you'd have to have some other quintile where there was less than a 20% chance of reaching the top 20% for it to all add up. If we rule out that case, then 20% seems like a ceiling on what is plausible here, and relative to that upper bound, these are quite large differences in rates of mobility, right? In some sense, your chances of achieving the American dream, so to speak, are twice as high if you're growing up in Canada almost as in the United States. Now, these cross-country comparisons, I think, are useful as motivation. They get a lot of people focused on whether the US is, in fact, a land of opportunity and so forth. But of course, we all know from years of studying these things in macroeconomics that it's difficult to interpret these cross-country differences. There are numerous things that are different across these countries, starting from the fact that just the income distribution is different cross-sectionally across these countries. So maybe it's easier to reach the top fifth in Canada than in the US simply because there's less inequality. And so there's less distance in sort of an absolute sense between the bottom and the top. So a different motivating fact is to look within the United States and look at patterns of mobility historically. So a different way in which people have thought about upward mobility across the generations, especially historically, is an absolute notion of upward mobility. To what extent do children go on to earn more than their parents did? So the US was thought to be a place where most kids would go on to have a higher standard of living than their parents. And so in some recent work that I've done with my colleagues, we again evaluate the extent to which that's the case. There are various details here which I'm not going to go into in constructing this sort of measure, but basically what we're after here is computing a very simple statistic. What fraction of children go on to earn more than their parents did, measuring both kids' and parents' incomes in their mid-30s and adjusting for inflation. And we're looking at that data by the year in which children were born. And what you can see is that for kids born in the 1940s and 1950s, it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream of moving up relative to your parents. 92% of kids born in 1940 went on to earn more than their parents did. But if you look at what has happened over time, you see a dramatic fading of the American dream measured in that way, such that kids born in the 1980s who are turning 30 now have only a 50-50 shot of doing better than their parents. So this trend and the international comparisons that I started out with have motivated a lot of concern, and I would say underlie a lot of the political frustration expressed in the United States and elsewhere, that people no longer feel that the US, and I think this is true in other countries as well, that it's no longer as easy to get ahead if you came from a low-income family or from a middle-income family. And so motivated by that, what I want to talk about today and what is my research group's central focus is basically the question of how can you increase upward mobility, how can you increase economic mobility, and what's driving the types of trends that I just showed you in the last slide. So this is an issue that we are certainly not the first to look at here. It's something economists, sociologists, and others have thought about for a long time. But my sense is that empirical evidence on economic mobility and our understanding of the drivers of economic mobility and inequality have been limited in particular by a lack of longitudinal data, panel data that allows us to follow people systematically over time. So there's a very large body of work on inequality in economics, but most of that empirical work on inequality, as many of you know, has used cross-sectional data to study poverty or inequality within a single generation. So this goes back to at least to the famous work of Simon Kuznets, more recently people like Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, Larry Katz, David Otter, Claudia Golden, and many others have written influential papers characterizing inequality at a single point in time and how that's evolved across years. And that's drawing on data like the census or current population surveys, things like that, where we have large samples on people at a given point in time. In order to study economic mobility, the types of things that I was showing in the first couple of slides, you fundamentally need data that allows you to follow people over time, and in particular, follow people across generations. And that has been much harder because typically it's very expensive to have large surveys that follow people over long periods of time. And so the recent availability of administrative data, information from tax and social security records, which does allow us to follow people on scale over long periods of time, I think has really opened up new avenues of research and sharpened our understanding of these issues. And so what I'm going to do here today is present an overview of some recent work I've done on economic mobility using longitudinal administrative data. And I should note at the outset that this work is, what I'm going to talk about is based on collaborations with many, many people, and in particular, John Friedman and Nathan Hendren, who are collaborators on many of the studies that I'll discuss here. So what I'm going to do is focus specifically on variation across neighborhoods at a very fine geographic level, because as I hope to show you, that provides a really useful lens in understanding the determinants of economic opportunity, no matter whether you're specifically interested in neighborhoods as a unit of change or interested in things at a more national or international level. I think this way of looking at the data, looking across places, turns out to be illuminating in understanding what's driving more broadly differences and trends in economic mobility. So I'm going to structure the talk in 4 parts. I'm first going to very briefly summarize the data and some of the simple methods that we use. I'm going to be deliberately brief here. There's a lot more detail in the papers that I'll cite along the way for those who are interested in following more closely exactly what we're doing. I'll then talk about the geography of opportunity, focusing within the United States on just a descriptive analysis of how economic mobility varies across places and what we can learn from that. Then in the third part, I will talk about the causal effects of neighborhoods. So to what extent is the observational variation that we're seeing in economic mobility across places driven by the causal effects of place, causal effects of environment, versus selection effects, just different types of people living in different places. And it's crucial to figure that out in order to get to the fourth thing that I'll wrap up with, which is what types of policies should we be thinking about if we want to increase upward mobility, try to reverse the fading American dream trend that I started out with. So let me start by telling you a little bit about the data and the methods. So the data that I'm going to use for essentially all of the papers I'll talk about here are census data covering the US population that we have linked to federal income tax returns from 1989 to 2015. So the census you're all familiar with covers in principle the entire population. It's a cross-sectional data set. We have a census every 10 years. What we've done is linked that to income tax returns that essentially everybody in the United States files, and other information from Social Security data that gives you a complete longitudinal panel spanning about 30 years of everybody in the United States. In what I'm going to talk about here, we are going to focus on a subset of that data, which is about 20 million kids born between 1978 and 1983 who grew up in the United States. So everything that I discuss here is going to pertain to people who grew up within the US as opposed to people who immigrated as adults. Why 1978 to 1983? Turns out to be some data restrictions in our ability to link kids to parents such that we're only able to focus on those cohorts. And moreover, we need kids to be old enough so that we can measure their incomes reliably in adulthood. As I'm sure any graduate students here will appreciate, you don't want to be measuring people's incomes when they're 23 or 24. There tends to be a trend in income after that point, so you want to wait till people are something like 30. in order to get a better sense of what their lifetime income looks like. And so that's why we focus on those cohorts. Throughout, in what I'm going to show you, we're going to measure parents' and kids' incomes in pre-tax dollars at the household rather than individual level. And throughout, we're going to find it convenient to focus on percentile ranks in the national income distribution. So I'm going to talk about local areas, but we're always ranking people in the national income distribution, and we're ranking people relative to others in their birth cohort. So for instance, you take all the 3.5 million kids born in 1980, rank them from 1 to 3.5 million based on their incomes when they're about 30 or 35, and convert that to percentile units. And we do the same thing for parents, comparing parents to other parents to adjust for life cycle issues where the levels of income vary over time. As I will show you, this rank transformation turns out to be quite convenient statistically in terms of summarizing intergenerational mobility, okay? So just to show you what that looks like, starting out at a national level with these rank measures. So this initial plot here just characterizes intergenerational mobility in ranks in the United States as a whole. So what we're plotting here is just a very simple non-parametric depiction of the conditional expectation of children's income ranks given their parents' income ranks. So a simple way to show the association between kids' incomes and parents' incomes. So there are 100 dots here, one for each percentile of the parental income distribution. And in each of those bins, we're just plotting the mean household income rank of the kids when we're measuring their incomes in their 30s. And what you see is a clear upward sloping relationship, which is well known from prior work, and we document more precisely here. And that just reflects the fact that kids born to richer parents tend to do better themselves. And so you can see that if you're born to parents in the top 1% of the income distribution, you on average are ending up somewhere around the 70th or 75th percentile. If you're born to parents, in contrast, at the bottom of the income distribution, you're ending up closer to the 30th percentile. Now, what I'm interested in doing is understanding how this intergenerational mobility curve varies across areas. And I'm going to focus in particular, to reduce the dimensionality of the statistics we're working with, on one particular measure, which I'll just call upward mobility, which is the expected income rank of kids born to parents at the 25th percentile of the income distribution. So think about it as, where do kids born to low-income parents below the median on average end up? And so in this particular case, in the nation as a whole, the predicted value given parents at the 25th percentile, if you just fit a line to that plot, that gets you to the 41st percentile. And the reason we're comfortable using a linear approximation, I should note here, is exactly driven by the rank transformation. So we have found that when you look at the conditional expectation of kids' ranks given parents' ranks, it's almost invariably perfectly linear like this. So in the nation as a whole, over time periods, in specific areas for different subgroups, for some underlying reason, that relationship is pretty stably linear. And so that allows you, obviously, to be able to parsimoniously summarize the relationship, the intergenerational mobility relationship, with just two parameters, the slope and the intercept. And so that's essentially what we're doing here. We run that regression, get the predicted value at the 25th percentile. That gives you the 41st percentile. To help interpret units a little bit, we're then going to map that back to a dollar value. So what is the 41st percentile of the income distribution when kids are in their mid-30s? That corresponds to a household income of about $32,000, okay? So that's the type of statistic that I'm going to call upward mobility that I'm going to focus on throughout this talk. All right, so let's now look at how those measures of upward mobility vary across areas in the United States. So this map depicts the geography of upward mobility within the US. Let me just first say a word on how we construct it, and then talk about what I think it's showing us. So what we do here is divide the US into 741 different metro and rural areas, what are called commuting zones, based on local commuting patterns. And in each of those areas, we take the set of kids who grow up in that place and estimate the same upward mobility statistic that I just showed you at the national level. So loosely speaking, this is the average household income for kids with parents at the 25th percentile who grew up in each of these places. That is, parents earning about $27,000 a year. Now we color the map so that blue colors represent areas with higher levels of upward mobility, where kids growing up in these low-income families end up reaching higher up in the income distribution, and red colors represent areas with lower levels of upward mobility. So let's start by just looking at the scale in the lower right. So notice that the spectrum of variation is quite substantial here. If you look at the darkest red colors in the southeast, for example, the kids born to parents at the 25th percentile, they're one generation later, they still have average incomes below $26,800. So essentially no mobility across generations, even though you'd expect some mean reversion, as we saw in the national chart. At the other end of the spectrum, though, if you look at the darkest blue colors in the center of the country, for example, you see values above $44,800. So really a substantial amount of upward mobility for the average kid growing up in a low-income family. Now, you can see the broad regional variation for yourself here. So, the center of the United States, what tend to be more rural areas, tend to have some of the highest levels of upward mobility. The Southeast and much of the industrial Midwest, so places like Cleveland or Detroit, which used to be traditional manufacturing hubs and now have changed in terms of industrial composition, tend to have much lower levels of upward mobility. And then parts of the coast, San Francisco Bay Area, for example, or the Northeast, tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. So the first thing to note in this map is just within the United States, you have substantial amounts of variation in rates of upward mobility. So when you ask, as I was kind of doing at the outset, is the US a land of opportunity or not? The answer turns out to depend greatly upon where you're growing up. If you look at the center of the country, the rates of mobility you see there actually exceed the rates you see in places like Denmark or Canada quite substantially. In contrast, if you look at the places in the darkest red colors, you have lower levels of mobility than for any country for which we currently have data. So really the US is a land of tremendous heterogeneity in terms of economic opportunity. So I think that's a useful observation in its own right. It's also very useful from a scientific perspective because we now have a lens through which we can start to study what the determinants of mobility are more precisely within a single data set, within sort of a unified framework where we can drill down more deeply. So what I'm going to do essentially in this talk is walk through a series of potential explanations for what drives these differences in mobility across areas and try to understand what the determinants are and then ultimately talk about what that might mean for policies to try to improve upward mobility in the places where kids' prospects of rising up don't look as good. So what's a first explanation that you might think of? So I think economists, when they see a map like this, often think about the structure of labor markets and the availability of jobs and the strength of local labor markets. So a very simple intuition is, maybe the places where you see a lot of upward mobility are places where you have booming economies, where kids who are growing up in low-income families are able to benefit from the fact that there was big growth in a particular industry that was prominent in that area, and that job growth and employment growth maybe is what leads to these differences in upward mobility. So that turns out not to be the case. One way that you can see that just in this map itself, for those who are familiar with some of the trends in the US, you take a place like Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta is one of the most rapidly growing cities in the US by any traditional metric. So if you look at job growth or wage growth, Atlanta is kind of the engine of growth in the Southeast. Yet, as you can see here, Atlanta is one of the worst cities in terms of upward mobility for kids growing up there. That is a more general pattern. If you plot the measures on the map that I just showed you before on the y-axis here, the measure of upward mobility from the map versus the job growth rate from 1990 to 2010, roughly the period over which the kids we're looking at were growing up, you can see that there's essentially no association between the two things. So you have places like Atlanta down here, which are very high growth cities, but also have very low levels of upward mobility. And then in contrast, you have other places in the upper left that don't have particularly high growth, but have pretty high levels of upward mobility. So how does that work? How can you both have a lot of wage and income growth and also not have a lot of upward mobility across generations? So what's going on here is that the way I think about it is places like Atlanta and Charlotte are essentially importing talent. So people move across places quite a bit within the US, and the people who are getting those higher paying jobs in places like Atlanta and Charlotte are people who tend to grow up in the Midwest or somewhere else in the United States. The kids who themselves are growing up in low and middle income families in Atlanta and Charlotte appear not to be benefiting from the job growth that's occurring there. So that's one very simple initial observation, that there is an important distinction between the changes in opportunities for people in a given area and what you'd see in repeated cross sections as we've traditionally looked at in thinking about measures of growth and inequality because of migration. These two things don't necessarily go hand in hand. Okay, so now let me come back to the map and talk about a second potential explanation. So anybody familiar with the demographics of the United States would recognize that there's a pattern here that might be associated with race. So places with larger African American populations, the Southeast, cities like Cleveland and Detroit, they have larger African American populations, larger Black populations, and they also tend to have lower levels of upward mobility, as you see here. Now, we know that there's a long historical legacy of racial disparities and discrimination in the United States, and we know that there are significant differences in outcomes between Blacks and whites. So is what we're seeing on this map just a manifestation of differences by race that's showing up as differences across places, or is it actually about differences in mobility within people of a given race? So that is, I think, a quite important issue to think about directly. It's an example of what I'll call later, a broader selection or sorting effect, but the race issue is particularly salient in the US. And so what I want to turn to next is disaggregating that map separately for Black Americans and white Americans. And I'm going to focus first on men for a reason that'll become clear in a second. So this is the same exact map as what I showed you before. The map on the left is for Black men. The map on the right is for white men. So the first thing you might notice when you look at this chart, you might think we've put these maps on two different color scales. It looks like the map on the left is on a red-yellow color scale, and the map on the right is on a blue-green color scale. But in fact, if you look at the bottom, you can see that the maps are on the same color scale. It's just that this illustrates a really striking fact about the US, which is that race is extremely important in driving differences in upward mobility. It's almost like there are two separate countries, completely non-overlapping distributions for Black Americans and white Americans. The very best places in terms of upward mobility for Black men growing up in families at the 25th percentile, a place like Boston, for example, have lower rates of upward mobility than essentially the very worst places for white men, places like Charlotte, North Carolina, for example. So there's no understating the fact that race is a central issue here. Racial disparities really matter. However, if you look within these maps, so if you look within the maps for white men, for example, you still see quite a bit of variation, even conditional on race. It matters quite a bit. If you're growing up in Appalachia, for example, or the Southeast, you have much lower rates of upward mobility than you do in the center of the country, even for white men. And notably, it's the South, which people often associate with a more disadvantage for Black Americans. What you see in these data is it's the white Americans living in the South that have particularly low rates of upward mobility relative to in the rest of the country. Okay, so race matters, but it still seems like place and geography matters as well. So I just showed you the pattern for men. Now I'm going to show you the same data for women, Black women versus white women. And notice you see a very different pattern here. These two maps have largely overlapping colors. And in fact, what you see more broadly is that rates of economic mobility for Black and white women are pretty similar to each other across the income distribution, whereas there are massive differences between Black and white men. So there's a race by gender interaction here that appears to be particularly important and illustrates the nuance in trying to figure out what is going on It's not a broad brush thing that applies uniformly across races or across areas. There are finer interactions that really matter. Now, throughout this talk, I'm going to largely focus on kids starting out in low-income families and talk about upward mobility. But in the case of race, it's, I think, also quite important and informative to think about downward mobility. And so I want to do that with this chart here, which shows you income mobility for Black versus white men now raised in high-income families in the top fifth of the income distribution. And what we're depicting here is basically the transition matrix for kids who start out in families in the top fifth of the income distribution, with purple dots depicting Black men and green dots depicting white men. And we're just showing which fifth, which quintile of the income distribution kids themselves end up in adulthood. And what you see is, I think, a really striking pattern, which is that if you're a white man born to an affluent family in the United States, you tend to sort of stay floating towards the top. The green dots tend to remain in the top quintile or the top 2 quintiles. Whereas for the purple dots, you see this, cascading toward the bottom, where even if you started out in a high-income family, you have a tremendously high chance of ending up in the middle class or actually in the bottom quintile of the income distribution. And so, the way I think about that visually is, if you think about achieving the American dream as climbing an income ladder for white Americans, it's more like being on a treadmill for Black Americans. Even after you've made it up in one generation, you have a tremendous tendency, due to various structural forces, to fall back down in the next generation, for Black men in particular. And it is that fact, I think, that fundamentally drives the persistence of racial disparities in the United States. So for 100 plus years, Black families have had significantly lower incomes than white families. And this is, I think, at the core of that. If you think about income dynamics and think about what the steady state of the income distribution is going to look like, if generation after generation, even after you rise up, you tend to fall back down, you're going to have a persistent gap between these two groups. So I'm going to focus mainly in this talk on how you help low-income people rise up. But in the case of Black Americans and Black men in particular, if you don't figure out how to keep families that have already made it to the middle class or the upper class even in the middle class or upper class, you're never going to fundamentally fix racial disparities, as I think is illustrated by this chart. Okay, so let me now come back to this map and talk about a third point. So we think it's not just about job growth, so kind of getting Amazon to come to your city is not fundamentally going to increase upward mobility, by itself. It's not just about race. There's more complexity to it than that. What I want to show next, to further uncover what might be going on here, is that the origins of these differences are much more local than you might think based on this broad national map. So in the national map, your eye tends to focus on the Midwest versus the South. Turns out these differences actually emerge at a much, much more local level. And so in order to illustrate that, I'm going to switch over to this interactive tool called the Opportunity Atlas, which you can look at yourself if you'd like on a website called opportunityatlas.org. And I'm going to zoom into one particular place called Nickerson Gardens, which is a public housing project in Los Angeles, in an area called Watts in Los Angeles, okay? And so what we're doing now is looking at the data that I had shown you before at the commuting zone level. We're now looking at that at the census tract level. There's 70,000 census tracts in the US, each of which has about 4,000 people. And in our most recent work, we've been able to drill down using population level data. You can construct pretty reliable estimates. So this has about 90% reliability at the tract level, meaning 90% of the variance is signal rather than noise, and what I'm going to show you here. And you can look at this, at a much finer level. So what we've done is zoomed into central Los Angeles. The first thing I'd like you to note here is that I haven't changed the color scale on the map relative to what I was showing you before. It's the exact same color scale. Notice that the spectrum of colors that you're seeing on the screen is exactly the same as what you were seeing at the national level. So to put it differently, you can go 2 or 3 miles down the street in Los Angeles, and it's like you're going from Atlanta to Iowa in terms of rates of upward mobility. So the differences, in kids' outcomes emerge at a super local level. Again, showing you that it's probably not about broad labor market differences or regional differences. It's about something much, much more granular. So now, the reason I picked this particular address, Nickerson Gardens, is that this is an area that's known to be, quite disadvantaged, very high poverty public housing project with a lot of crime and incarceration and so forth. Has been featured in a number of movies in the US and things like that. And I'm going to focus in particular here. We can look at different subgroups of the data, and I'm going to look at Black men, as we were just talking about. And what you can see is if you look at Black men, and let's look at the lowest income families, which is what's relevant here. Black men growing up in the very lowest income families in this area of Watts, in this public housing project, they have average incomes in adulthood, if you look over to the left, of just $3,300. So if you take the set of Black men who grew up, they're typically going to be in families, below the 10th percentile of the income distribution. Their mean income is $3,300, right? So that's exceptionally low. How do you end up with a mean income of just $3,300? So it's got to be that a huge fraction of these men are not working at all. And that is indeed the case. In fact, you can look at a variety of other outcomes beyond income. And so I'm going to click over here now on the incarceration rate. And what you can see is, I think, a really striking statistic. 44% of the men who grew up in this particular census tract are incarcerated on a single day, the date of the 2010 census. So if you think about what fraction were incarcerated at some point over their lifetime among the kids growing up there, it's going to be something like 60 or 70%. And so that, illustrates the tremendously concentrated disadvantage that you see in certain neighborhoods in the United States. Now, if you were from Los Angeles and familiar with this area, you might say, I'm maybe surprised by the magnitudes of this, but I kind of knew that this was a really tough neighborhood, high crime rates, high poverty, so I'm not terribly surprised to see such adverse outcomes, at least in a qualitative sense. But here's something where I think these types of data can be quite useful, where even somebody from Los Angeles might not have guessed this. So if you just go like roughly a mile south, right, to a place like, let's say here in central Compton, which is, if you look at cross-sectional data, look at poverty rates, income distributions, you wouldn't see that Compton is tremendously different from Watts if you were sort of driving around. Yet, if you look at the kids who grew up there, only 6.2% of the kids who grew up in Compton in similar families end up incarcerated, as opposed to 44% in this one housing project in Watts. More generally, our sense is a lot of the crime that's occurring in this area, you can map its roots back to this one particular place in Watts, where lots of the kids who end up on a problematic path down the road have had some contact with Watts along the way. And so that's one example. You can type in any address and look at numerous other such examples in the data where you can hone in a very precise way and see that the origins of these issues appear to be extremely local. Okay, so let me now come back to this and take a next step. So we've seen that the origins of these differences in kids' outcomes are very granular. So you might ask, okay, so what is it that's actually driving that variation across places, at least in a predictive sense? I've given you a sense that there's this substantial variation. What are the main predictors of these differences across places? And so in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into great detail on the analysis we've done on that front. I'll just briefly summarize what we find. We've correlated these differences in mobility across areas with various factors that economists and sociologists have talked about over the years. And here I'm just summarizing the 4 strongest correlations that we find. So we find that places that tend to be in the blue colors on the maps that I showed you, the high mobility areas, they tend to have lower poverty rates. They tend to have more stable family structures, so more 2-parent families in particular. They tend to have greater social capital. So the way I think about that is the old adage that it takes a village to raise a child. There are various proxies for how connected a community is. We don't necessarily have great data on that, but to the extent we're able to proxy for that using things like membership in civic organizations or various measures of how much of a cohesiveness there is in a community, you tend to find that places with more social capital tend to have higher levels of mobility. And then as you might expect intuitively, places with better schools tend to have higher levels of mobility. Together, these 4 sets of factors have an R squared of about 50 or 55% in explaining the differences in mobility across places that I've been showing you. So there's a lot that is not captured by these observable factors, but there's a good chunk that is. Places that are not highly concentrated areas of poverty, where you've got some social stability and so forth, good schools tend to have high levels of mobility. I want to emphasize there that that is a descriptive fact. We don't know yet that any of these particular things have a causal impact on mobility, but it's still useful to understand, what the types of properties are of the places that have high versus low levels of mobility. I want to show one final descriptive result, which is I've been talking about neighborhoods and talking about them in particular at a census tract level. But an interesting question in urban economics is how big should I think of a neighborhood as? What is the size of a neighborhood as it matters for upward mobility? And so to address that, I'm going to turn to this chart here, which examines the spatial decay in the association between one of the covariates that I showed you on the previous slide, poverty rates, and rates of upward mobility. So I showed you, as I mentioned before, there's a strong negative correlation of about something like 0.5 between poverty rates and rates of upward mobility. What I'm going to do now is look at that correlation by block, so block by block in the data, and I'm going to regress upward mobility in my block on the poverty rate in my block, the block that's 1 over, the block that's 2 over, 3 over, and so forth, all at the same time in order to understand what the spatial decay looks like. And so what I'm showing you in these first 2 dots is if we normalize the first correlation, the correlation with poverty rates in your own block at 100%, you see that 1 block over, the poverty rate there, controlling for the poverty rate in your own block, has a correlation that's about 60% as large as what we see with the poverty rate in your own block. Okay, so now let's look at that for all the subsequent blocks. And what you see is an incredibly rapid spatial decay. Poverty rates that are more than about 0.6 miles away from where your house is have essentially no association with your outcomes. So the way to think about this, we see this not just for poverty rates, but a variety of other characteristics, is that the determinants of outcomes are incredibly local. It's not like it's a few miles away that matters. If I tell you what's going on within a half-mile radius of your house, basically telling you about what's going on beyond that ring is irrelevant in predicting your outcomes. Again, showing you, I think in a particularly direct way, that the origins of these issues are highly local. Okay, so I next want to turn to thinking about this observational variation that I've been showing you. How much of that is driven by the causal effects of place versus sorting, differences in the type of people living in different places? So why am I interested in this issue? Why do I think that's the next key step in this agenda? I think the answer matters for at least 2 reasons. It matters to individual families when you put out data like this. If you're a family trying to decide where to live, you want to know if you move to a place in a bluer color, will your kids actually have better outcomes? Or is it just about different people living there and you don't pick that up? And I think it matters fundamentally for the types of policy solutions you're going to think about to increase economic mobility. If the causal effects of place are very large, then place-based interventions, looking at the place as the unit of change, makes a lot of sense. If it's fundamentally about sorting, then it's about trying to help different types of people who happen to live in different places. Place might end up being a useful tag or predictor in an optimal tax kind of context, but it doesn't fundamentally matter in and of itself. So I think this is a very important issue. It's an issue that people have tried to study for many decades, and I think we've been able to make some recent progress in figuring this out. So I'm going to briefly summarize how we identify the causal effects of place by talking about 2 research designs. The first is a quasi-experimental approach, where we analyze the outcomes of kids who move at different ages across all the tracks in our data. And then the second is an experimental approach, a pure experiment, which I'll come to in a second. I'll be brief on both of these in the interest of time. So on the quasi-experimental front, let me set it up as follows. Let me first begin by asking you to consider families who move across census tracts in our data when their child is exactly 5 years old, okay? And what we're gonna do is regress the kid's income rank in adulthood, which I'm gonna call YI, on the mean rank of kids with the same parental income level in the destination tract to which they move. Okay, so that's shown by this simple linear equation here, where Y bar PD denotes the average income rank of kids growing up in families at percentile P in destination D, okay? And I'm gonna include parent decile by origin fixed effects in this regression, so I'm identifying this key coefficient BM purely based on differences in the destinations to which children are moving. So to show you concretely what that looks like in the data, here's a non-parametric bin scatter plot representation of that regression that I just showed you, where we're plotting the mean rank of the kid on the y-axis versus the difference, the predicted difference in the kid's rank based on kids who grew up from birth, I'm gonna call permanent residence, in the destination versus the origin. So the way to think about this is on the far right of the chart, kids are moving to places where the predicted income ranks of children at the same parental income level are 10 percentile points higher than where they started out. So on the far right, this is like you're moving from a very red colored part of the map, like a Watts sort of area, to a very blue colored part of the map. On the far left is the opposite, people who are moving to places where you see much worse outcomes for kids who grew up there from birth. So what you can see here is now we're plotting the movers' ranks versus these differences for the kids who never moved. And you can see that there's a strong relationship between the two. In particular, if you move to a place where we see 10 percentile point higher outcomes, your own outcomes are 8 percentile points higher. So there's a slope of about 0.8, okay? So that is consistent with the idea that places have causal effects. When you move to a place that looks in a bluer color, you tend to have significantly better outcomes in adulthood when you move there at age 5. But by itself, it doesn't prove that places have causal effects because, of course, you worry that the people who move to the places that look really good are different from the people who move to the places that look worse in terms of rates of upward mobility, right? There may be selection effects in terms of where people are choosing to move. So generalizing upon this, I'm showing you the data here, estimating the slope for kids who move exactly at age 5. What I'm gonna do now is estimate that slope separately for kids who moved at different ages. The slope at age 5, shown in the red dot of 0.81, is plotted there. And then we run that exact same regression that I showed you for kids who moved at age 2, 3, 4, and so forth and so on, all the way up to kids whose parents moved at older ages. So what you see in this chart is, I think, two things. First of all, there's clearly a selection effect here. So in this particular version of the chart, we're measuring incomes when kids are 24 years old. But you can see that even when their parents move to a higher upward mobility area, when they're, say, 27 or 28, we're seeing that being associated with better outcomes for children when they were 24. Okay, so that slope is still positive, even to the right of the dashed line. That obviously has to be a selection effect. The fact that your parents moved to 27 is associated with your having higher incomes at 24, obviously can't be a causal effect. So the key assumption we're gonna make that underlies this quasi-experimental design is that that selection effect that we're seeing on the right side is constant across ages. We're gonna assume that the extent to which different types of people move to the higher mobility areas is invariant with respect to the age of the child, okay? That is a strong assumption. I'm gonna come back to evaluate it in a second, but let's just run with that for a second. If you make that assumption, that basically means that I can account for selection by tracing out this horizontal line going backwards, and any difference between the plotted points and that horizontal line prior to age 23 can be interpreted as the causal effect of moving to that place at a given age. Okay, so under that maintained identification assumption, what you see from this chart is that the earlier you move to a higher upward mobility area, the bigger the gains you get in adulthood. If you move at age 5 instead of 10 or 10 instead of 15, we see significantly better outcomes. And we basically see this convergence pattern where if you subtract out this intercept of about 0.3, you are picking up something like 2/3 or 65% of the difference that we're seeing in the observational data if you move to a higher upward mobility place at birth, okay? So that conclusion that neighborhoods have significant causal effects in proportion to exposure, that there's this sort of dosage effect, is predicated on this critical identification assumption that selection effects are constant by age. Now, is that assumption actually valid? So we are going to use two approaches to evaluate the validity of this assumption. And I'm just going to briefly summarize them here without going into the details. The first thing you can do is put in family fixed effects and compare siblings within the same family. So imagine you have a family that moves with a 2-year-old and a 7-year-old to a place that has higher levels of upward mobility. Remarkably, you get back exactly the same chart that I showed you before, even with family fixed effects. The 2-year-old does better than the 7-year-old in proportion to that 5-year age gap. So that rules out any selection effects that are fixed across families. If you were worried that the types of families who move when their kids are young are different from the types of families who move when their kids are older, that's taken care of by this approach of comparing kids within the same family. A second thing we do, which I think is actually ultimately more compelling and is higher powered, is what I call a set of outcome-based placebo tests, where we exploit the fact that there's heterogeneity in these place effects across gender, quantiles, and across different types of outcomes. And just to briefly summarize what you get there with a simple example, we find that there are some places that are particularly good for boys, having high levels of upward mobility. There's some places that are particularly good for girls. Imagine now that you have a family that moves with both a daughter and a son to a place that's particularly good for boys. You see that their son's outcomes improve in proportion to the number of years they grow up there, but the daughter's outcomes don't change at all. You see this very gender-specific exposure pattern, which if you think about it, if there were omitted variables that we were worried were driving this pattern, it would be very surprising if they happened to line up differentially by gender in proportion to the amount of time they spent there, and so forth. So based on this sort of evidence, we've convinced ourselves with this design that it really seems like a big chunk of the variation that we're seeing across places is driven by the causal effects of place. I want to briefly summarize now a second complementary line of evidence that further supports that conclusion. So when Nathan Hendren and I first wrote this quasi-experimental paper, we recognized that it was at odds with what's viewed as the gold standard experiment in this area called the Moving to Opportunity experiment, where families were given housing vouchers in pure random assignment, about 5,000 families in the mid-1990s, to encourage them to move to different neighborhoods. And that work, analyzed by Larry Katz and many others, had found, somewhat disappointingly, very limited evidence of any causal impact on economic outcomes. What we did is went back to the Moving to Opportunity data, linked it to the tax record so that we could follow kids over a longer period of time, and we came with the very simple hypothesis that there would be a dosage effect here, that we would maybe see bigger effects for kids who moved at young ages, even though prior studies had not found significant effects for kids who moved at older ages or for adults. And that turns out to be exactly what you see in the data. So basically, in the Moving to Opportunity experiment, to give you an example from New York, what they did is took a set of families that grew up in very high poverty public housing projects, like the Martin Luther King Towers in Harlem. They were randomly then assigned to either stay there, move to a different set of areas receiving what are called Section 8 housing vouchers. In this case, a place called Soundview in Bronx was a common place where many people moved. Or they received what were called experimental housing vouchers, where they had to move to areas with less than a 10% poverty rate. Commonly, those people moved to a place called Wakefield in the North Bronx, about 10 miles away. And so what we essentially do is compare the earnings of those three groups. This is for kids who moved before they were the age of 13, so relatively young kids. And you can see that the kids who were randomly assigned to the experimental voucher group who moved to these lower poverty, higher opportunity areas have about 30% higher earnings in adulthood than the kids who were randomly assigned to the control group. They're also significantly more likely to go to college. By contrast, if you look at adults, the same comparison, you see no impact at all. So that is exactly aligned with the pattern that I showed you before of this dosage impact of neighborhoods where you see larger impacts for kids who move at younger ages. More broadly, that work has now been replicated in many countries across the world where you see this very clear pattern of decay. The earlier you move to higher opportunity areas measured in various different ways, the better your outcomes are. Okay, so that really seems like a stable pattern that neighborhoods matter at this local exposure dependent, in this local exposure dependent way. Okay, so to summarize here, I think the main lesson to take from what I've shown you is that local environment from birth to something like your early 20s has a substantial causal impact on kids' outcomes. Approximately 2/3 of the observational variation in upward mobility that we're seeing across places is due to the causal effects of place. To put a number on it, if you were to move from the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile place within your own county, so sort of a feasible move a family might make, that's going to increase lifetime earnings by about $200,000 for the average low-income kid. So there's a fairly substantial amount of variation across these local areas. So in the last few minutes, and I'll try to leave a few minutes at the end for questions, but I want to get to this as kind of the end point here. I want to talk about what I think these findings, these research findings imply for policies to increase upward mobility and how we're trying to do more in that direction. Okay, so in light of what I've shown you, I think it makes sense to think about 3 different types of policy approaches to increase upward mobility. So the key fact, I think, that emerges from the data is that the determinants of economic mobility are incredibly local and are related to childhood environmental conditions. So I think that leads to 3 natural ways to thinking about increasing economic mobility. One is to help people get to sort of a different pipeline of opportunity. If you think about each half-mile radius in the US providing a different pipeline to opportunity, a different neighborhood, one is to just help low-income people access more of those blue-colored areas. So to put it differently, to try to reduce segregation or help families move to opportunity. Now, of course, that's not going to be a scalable approach in and of itself. Reducing segregation, we think, is a useful thing to try to do, but it can't be your only approach. You also want to think about how you invest in the places that are currently in the red colors to improve economic mobility in those areas. So that's the second strategy that I think is quite sensible. And then the third is recognizing that after age 18, the key touch point to influence kids is not necessarily where they grow up or their household, but where they're going to college. And so thinking about how to improve access to higher education is, I think, another independent domain that would be motivated by this set of findings. So I'm not going to go into each of the 3 of these. We're basically organizing our research efforts going forward around these 3 pillars. I'm going to illustrate what we're doing by focusing in some more detail on the first one, and then I'll conclude. Okay, so to motivate this, I'm going to start out with this snapshot from the Opportunity Atlas data here from Seattle rather than Los Angeles. So notice in Seattle, you see the same type of variation that we were seeing in Los Angeles, a booming economy, but there are still many places in Seattle where kids really don't have very good prospects of climbing up the income ladder. There are other places where kids in low-income families do extremely well. Now, you might think one thing you could do in Seattle is to try to help families that are living in these red-colored areas move to some of the bluer-colored areas. Now, that's not some pie-in-the-sky sort of policy. In fact, in the US, we already spend about $45 billion a year on various affordable housing policies whose intent is to do precisely that, to give families access to better neighborhoods. Unfortunately, it seems like those policies sort of don't work. They don't achieve that aim in practice. So what we're doing here is showing in the green dots the most common locations where families who are receiving housing vouchers from the federal government currently live. There are about 2.2 million such families in the US. And what you can see in Seattle, which is the case more broadly in the US, is that these families tend to be clustered in the low opportunity places, in the red colored areas on the map, right? So despite the fact that you are receiving rental assistance worth on average about $12,000 or $15,000 a year from the government, you are still living in an area where we think poverty is likely to persist across generations. So the policies don't really seem to be reducing the persistence of poverty across generations very effectively. So motivated by that pattern, we were interested in understanding, why this is the case, and what you might be able to do to change that. So the first explanation you might think of, and this is particularly sensible to bring up here in the context of the Marshall Lecture, is that maybe this is about prices and the supply of housing. So maybe it's just that everybody wants to live in an area where their kids will do well, and maybe that drives up prices in those areas, and they're just too expensive for families, for low-income families to afford. That would just be a completely straightforward economic explanation for what's going on. So you can assess that. You can plot these measures of upward mobility that I was showing you here. Each dot represents a different census tract in Seattle versus rents. There is an upward sloping relationship, as you might expect intuitively, but there's a tremendous amount of dispersion around that line. You can move from a place like Federal Way, which is a common place where low-income families currently live using housing vouchers, basically straight up on this chart to a place like Woodinville, where your kids would have much better outcomes and you wouldn't pay more in terms of rent, okay? And so that, I think, raises the question. It's not just about prices, right? So why don't more low-income families move to opportunity? And I think there are two different classes of explanations that you might have in mind. The first is that it could be about preferences. Maybe families prefer to stay in their current neighborhoods because of other amenities. People care about more than just their kids' long-term outcomes. They care about proximity to family, about commute time, things like that. So maybe this is about deep-rooted preferences that you want to stay in the places you've chosen. A very different explanation is that perhaps this is about barriers. Maybe families want to move to these high-opportunity places, but they lack information, they face search frictions, landlords don't want to rent to them, there are various frictions in the market that prevent them from moving where they'd like to move. So we, in collaboration with the local government and housing authorities, recently ran a randomized trial with several hundred families to help families with housing vouchers move to high opportunity neighborhoods. And what we did, just to briefly summarize, is provided some services to reduce the barriers that families might potentially face in moving to opportunity. So this was assistance in the search process, so somebody to help you identify suitable units, to potentially drive you to look at those places and so forth. It was direct engagement with the landlords to try to get them to rent their units to housing voucher holders, to low-income families. It was a bit of short-term financial assistance, on average about $1,000 per family, to help pay security deposits and things like that. The total cost of the services we provided up front was about $2,600 per family, which is not a small sum, but it is actually a pretty small sum relative to the total cost of the program that is already in place of providing these vouchers. It's only about 2% on average of these voucher payments, so a relatively small incremental expense. And so this is an RCT where some families were randomly selected to receive these additional services, and other families just got the voucher and could choose to live wherever they wanted. And what you see is a dramatic shift in where families ended up choosing to live. In the control group, 14% of families moved to what we designated as high upward mobility areas, roughly the top third of places in terms of upward mobility within Seattle. In the treatment group, that jumped to 54%. And you can see this very clearly on a map. If you look at the neighborhoods that families chose to move to, the red pins here show you where families in the control group moved to. What's highlighted in the blue shaded area are the high opportunity areas, the highest upward mobility places within Seattle. And you can see that the red pins are not in those blue high opportunity areas. Now, if you contrast where the treatment group families moved, it's a dispersed set of areas within the high opportunity zone. And in my view, this is one of the most encouraging results I've seen in this space, above and beyond this particular policy where it shows that with a small tweak on the margin, we can dramatically shift the program's impacts on segregation and ultimately upward mobility. It shows that segregation is ultimately not the consequence of deep-rooted preferences, which would be really hard to shift, but rather is the result perhaps of small barriers that we can address through changes in policy. And I think, even beyond this program, that is something quite encouraging in an era of rising segregation and polarization in the US and across the world. So I'm going to skip some of these additional details and just quickly wrap up. So, we recognize, as I was just saying, that the approach of reducing segregation can be quite valuable, but it's also important to think about how you can invest in places to improve outcomes there. And we are doing work on that front. I don't yet have an answer to say, exactly what works, but basically, I think the type of data I've been showing you suggests that investing in developing human capital in places that currently have lower levels of economic mobility, rather than just focusing on the labor market, is a strategy that makes sense in terms of improving economic opportunity. What specific place-based investments one should make, I think, is a really important area for further research. There are important methodological issues there to resolve. I won't get into those here, but for those interested in these issues, I think that is a really interesting area to study, both in the US and in other countries. So let me conclude by just talking about how we in our group are trying to support future work on equality of opportunity by mentioning some resources that might be helpful to people in the audience. The first thing to note is that all of the data that I've been showing here is now publicly available, in particular the local area statistics for the US that I discussed here by census tract, by racial group, and so forth, are all just posted on the web. And that, I think, can be a useful input, as we're starting to see for many other researchers working on a variety of other questions. So I hope that'll be useful to some of you. Second, while we are focused principally on the US in our group at Harvard, we recognize that there are a similar set of issues in many other countries, and there's a lot, I think, to be learned from doing similar work in other countries. And so we're trying to support that work. A lot of that relies on data availability, and there's Scandinavian countries that have similar data, and people are doing interesting similar things there. I want to give you one example from a very different setting in India, where Sam Asher and Paul Novosad at Dartmouth have been doing some interesting parallel work. And this is showing you the geography of upward mobility within India. And you can see, even larger variation in India than I was showing you in the United States. And there's a similar agenda there related to caste differences and other types of policies that I think can be quite fruitful that they are leading. And in parallel, I would imagine there's much to be learned from other countries as well. And then the final thing that we're trying to do is help train the next generation of researchers and policymakers, as many of us here are teaching at our own institutions. I've been surprised to find at Harvard, many of our students actually have the perception that economists don't work on issues like inequality, or that's been discussed in the media recently, that economists don't think about inequality, and I think that's obviously far from the case. And so exposing students more to these types of methods and ideas, I think, can be quite useful. And so in that vein, I've been teaching a new class for undergraduates at Harvard called Using Big Data to Solve Economic and Social Problems. And the reason I mentioned that here is it covers some of the topics that I've been discussing. All of the materials are available online for anybody who's interested in using them. And one of the things we've been encouraged to see at Harvard, related to the themes of this talk, is that way of teaching introductory economics. There are no prerequisites here. It draws a very different set of students. So we saw that it had many more women and a much more diverse group of students than economics typically attracts. I think that's very important for our field moving forward, to have a broader diversity of students. And so I'm hoping this way of trying to introduce students to economics can be a complement to our traditional approaches. And I hope that will also be useful to some of you. So let me end there, and I'm happy to take a few questions if we have a couple minutes. Thanks so much.
questions? Yeah, so there's going to be a walking mic.
So when you designate an area as upward mobility, you rely on data for those born between 78 and 83. Mm-hmm. So how much might this change over time? If I look at neighborhoods, gentrification, there might be different principles in schools.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. As you can imagine, when we were actually trying to do things on the ground in Seattle, for example, or as we're working with other cities around the US, that is the first thing people will ask you, right? Is this data really relevant for kids growing up today? So the way I think about this from a conceptual perspective is it really boils down to a prediction problem. So the variable we're interested in is upward mobility for kids growing up today in these places. We can't see that. It's fundamentally unobservable for another 20 years. So the way I think about it is, what's the best predictor of that variable? And so we have done various exercises where we use historical data to basically predict upward mobility for birth cohort T, using data from cohort T minus X and vary X, and then also bring in various other predictors, like you could use current poverty rates or other contemporaneous measures and so forth. And so what emerges there is, you're absolutely right, some neighborhoods could change significantly over time, but by and large, these things are pretty stable. So you have something like a 90% serial correlation on a decadal level. So if I were to predict upward mobility using data from cohort T minus 1, the predictive value I get is only about 10% larger than if I use data that was a decade older. So that doesn't tell you that every single place is the same, but it says that this thing is a useful starting point. And the historical data is a useful starting point. And then what we do is use more recent measures like school district data, for instance, on test scores of low-income kids to get a sense of whether any specific places are changing dramatically. So in Seattle, we got local school district data, tried to see if any particular places had changed a lot, and then used that to make a post hoc kind of adjustment to the definitions. My sense is that's probably the best we can do at the moment, but I think more to be done on that front as we have more data. Back.
Hi, my question is, you presented evidence that moving to a better neighborhood is a good idea, but at the same time you say that family network could be relevant. So when you move to another neighborhood, maybe you can lose that network. So what do you find in your data about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think that can vary depending upon the type of family. Let me again give you an example from our experience in Seattle. So we found, a large fraction of families chose to move to higher opportunity places after the support we had provided. Some families did not, and we think possibly for good reason related to the example that you're giving. So in particular, families that spoke a different language and didn't speak English and had very tight ethnic links to a particular, the Ethiopian community in a particular part of Seattle or something like that, didn't want to move. And it could perfectly well be the case that there are heterogeneous treatment effects, and that family should not move to what appears to be a higher opportunity area on average. So I think that underscores why it doesn't make sense to have a policy that requires families to move to places that are higher opportunity, because there might be heterogeneity in treatment effects. I think facilitating choice is the right idea. More broadly, we are trying to study how networks matter more directly using social network data. It's something we're hoping to put out in the next few months. And I think the types of effects you're describing are important, but on average, we're finding for most families, there's a significant gain, as you saw here. Chetty? Yeah.
So, you showed that people don't move to better areas, but they should in some sense. Why don't they do it?
Yeah.
Is it lack of information they don't understand
Yeah.
that they would benefit? Is it financial frictions that they somehow, or is it barriers that landlords discriminate?
Yeah, so thanks for that. So that gives me an opportunity to go back to a slide that I actually skipped in the interest of time. So let me first just underscore, the importance of your question. So I showed you the families are moving to significantly different areas, right? We also surveyed the families after they moved, and they're significantly happier, the families in the treatment group, and they say they're more likely to stay. So it's not just that we kind of steered them to these different neighborhoods and then they don't like it, they actually seem measurably more satisfied. So in that sense, it appears that they're not optimizing in some sense on an ex-ante basis, and that motivates the question of what are the barriers that are at play. And so in economics, particularly in public finance, people now, it's become standard to think about informational issues as a key barrier. We often, models of search costs have we model search costs as financial frictions typically in the housing context or in the unemployment or other contexts. But our sense is that the mechanisms actually are neither of those. So we, working with a sociologist on our team, Stephanie DeLuca, talked to 110 families in person in their houses, spent about 2 hours with each of them to try to understand what the barriers actually were. And it was not so much that they said, I had no idea that growing up in this other part of Seattle would be better for my kids. They actually said, yeah, that kind of makes sense for me. It makes sense to me. I wanted to move there, but I just thought I couldn't. And it was not that I didn't literally have the money necessarily. It was more about, the simplest way I can summarize it is I actually visited some of these families myself, which was an incredibly humbling and informative experience. And what you see is something like scarcity and bandwidth constraints, that people are dealing with so many challenges that moving to a high opportunity place is kind of the last thing on their list. So you've single mom with 4 kids working 2 jobs. Do you really have the time to figure out the paperwork and all that stuff? And so, in these interviews, you see a lot of discussion of emotional and psychological support. I have somebody who's helping me in this complicated bureaucratic process. Somebody who's going to help me deal with landlords where I applied to 25 units and people saw that I had a housing voucher and I'm a minority or something like that, and they didn't even return my phone call. Now when I have somebody who speaks differently and can be an advocate for me, when they call, that completely changes the picture. And exactly when I needed it, I got some financial support. I think the combination of things really seems to have made an impact. And I think the question you ask, for me, underscores that in a reduced form sense, I think we capture in our economic models with a cost, a search cost, these types of frictions, but unpacking what those costs are and thinking about these sociological and psychological mechanisms really seems first order for figuring out what's going on.
Go ahead.
First, thanks, this was brilliant. So I was thinking, since like the Marshall lecture, that makes me think about externalities. So it's clear that taking people to high opportunity neighborhoods makes them better. So what about the low opportunity neighborhoods? How do you make the low opportunity neighborhoods better?
How do you make them better?
Yes.
Yes. So you're exactly asking the questions that I didn't quite get to at the end here. So it's a great question. So as I was saying, I think it's about figuring out how you invest in human capital in those places. So often when people think about improving a neighborhood, the ideas that are floated are, we need to give a tax credit for employers to come and locate in this place. But as I was showing you up front, the example of Atlanta, I don't think that's a sufficient condition in and of itself, because that's going to induce migration responses, and it's not obvious you will help the local community. So I think it's about how you develop human capital in certain places. Now, the question you're asking basically is what specific programs, what types of interventions can have an impact? So is it about better schools, mentoring programs, reducing crime, various things you might think about? I think the honest answer is I don't know, and frankly, I think nobody really knows exactly what the answer to that question is. And the reason for that is it's been very hard. It comes back to what I was saying at the very beginning on the lack of longitudinal data. To study these questions, you need to be able to follow people systematically over time in a given place. We are now trying to do that on scale and address 2 key methodological challenges where we've made some initial strides, but this is where I think it'd be very useful for others to think about these issues as well. So first, figuring out how you distinguish causal effects from dynamic sorting is extremely important. So you can invest in a place and it looks like the neighborhood's gotten a lot better, but often what you see is that's because a bunch of other people moved in, the place gentrified, and you didn't actually help the initial targeted recipient. So we are using now extended historical longitudinal data, trying to study a whole bunch of historical place-based policies and figure out exactly what things help the people who are already there. So that's one challenge, figuring out how you deal with that. The second comes back to the point of neighborhoods changing over time and having to wait 20 years to see upward mobility. I actually think an important methodological issue in this space is how you can cut down that timeline by identifying short-term proxies that predict rates of upward mobility. So this could be something like test scores or other measures earlier in childhood. But from an econometric perspective, I think thinking about how we can systematically identify what's called in the statistics literature surrogates for these long-term outcomes would also help advance our understanding of this issue. So that doesn't directly answer your question, but that's the path to trying to figure it out, I think.
Okay, we're running out of time, but let's have one more question, and then we'll conclude after that, if there is one more. I don't see any eager hands, or do you?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I don't know. Oh yeah, it works. Can you tell us anything about downward mobility? What happens to the children of the rich who move to poor neighborhood? Is it symmetric?
So I showed you that one chart on downward mobility for black versus white men, right? So you see very high rates of downward mobility for black men in general in the US. The reason I didn't spend much time on downward mobility in general from a neighborhood angle is there's one simple fact that summarizes the pattern, which is if you're rich, it doesn't matter that much where you grow up. If you're poor, it matters a lot where you grow up. So if you're at the top of the income distribution, your outcomes look basically the same if you're growing up in Atlanta, in Iowa, or in Silicon Valley. If you're poor, there's a tremendous divergence. And I think that makes sense if you think about it intuitively. You can basically insulate your kids from local conditions, send your kids to a private school, et cetera, if you're rich. Now, obviously, there are other dimensions in which downward mobility differs. I pointed out the one by race in particular, but that's the geographic pattern.
Okay, thank you, Raj, for an absolutely fantastic Marshall lecture.
Thank you.